Welcome everyone. Okay. Welcome everyone. I'm really excited to moderate this panel. My name is Keith Green. You probably saw me earlier at the opening conference. Welcome. And we're excited to have three really interesting and varied papers for this particular session. Just in terms of housekeeping, note that we have a Q&A button. So although we'll have questions and answers at the end, at any point during the conversation, please feel free to pop your question or even comment inside that box, and we'll get to it afterwards. We'll also have all the presenters present first, and then at the end, we'll have a full conversation, take your questions then. We'll also be going by the order listed in the program. So we'll have Dr. Evan Turner first, followed by Dr. Reginald Bess, and then thirdly, Dr. Albrecht Classen. Let me just also do a brief introduction, and I'll do one for each presenter, but before they speak. So first is Dr. Evan Turner. His presentation is entitled "On Comparing Black Film Actors in East and West Germany." He is Associate Professor of German, Professor of Film and Media Studies at the University of Cincinnati, where he directs the German BA program, the BFA in Games and Animation, and the UC Game Lab. In this context, he has written many articles and book chapters on the representation of Asian people and BIPOC folks in East German cinema, and co-led the 2023 DAFA Film Library Summer Film Institute on Blackness and Black experiences in East Germany. We certainly welcome Dr. Turner, and I'll hand over the floor to him.
Thank you, Keith, and thanks especially to the organizers, Rosemary, Emily, and Sonia. I'm thinking of everybody else who is involved. This is an enormous organizational effort, and I appreciate all that you put in. I only have 20 minutes with you, so I'm just going to work through some recent research that I'm doing more or less to connect two halves of the Cold War together, hopefully successfully. I'm going to first read off a few names. Julius Ongewe, George Bird, Elfie Fiegert, Aubrey Pankey, Hadiatu Berry, Rados Bokel, Günter Kaufmann, Angie Stardust, Nino Sando, Pierre Sanusi Bliss. These are names of Black German, Black American, and African actors from German filmmaking during the Cold War, when there were two legitimate, or at least semi-legitimate, German states. I say these performers' names here in an opening statement as a sort of intentional polemical act because I want to ask you how many of these names are instantly recognizable to you? Who remains then relatively obscure? Would any of them, in your opinion, qualify as a star within the German film system? This research is primarily for a book on stardom, and the star system in German cinema. I was asked to write on Black German stars, and especially during the Cold War, and I came up with a more interesting uh, set of findings than perhaps they wanted. Um, if a film star is defined as an actor whose widespread celebrity originates in the cinema, someone whose very name on a movie poster can entice audiences to the movie theaters, maybe say there was essentially no Black German film stars in the latter half of the 20th century. And again, Louis Brody was a Black film star in the early half of the 20th century, but we're not going to go there in this talk. Um, so want to say that film stars are essentially star images, as Richard Dyer writes. They're constructed personages in media texts, and they then re-signify themselves in the portrayal of characters in fictional films. On the one hand, we have Black German star images that would evoke bewilderment, as their very existence transgresses against normative self-conceptions of Germans as white. Um, but it also then famously positions Black Germans in Michelle Wright's terms as others from within, from without. On the other hand, their portrayals of Black, often caricatures in films created by white Germans, are naturalized and seen as normal, even when acting out these stereotypes with little interiority or even grounding in their own lived experiences. Cold War audiences often had their own childhoods in the 1920s or 1930s, where white performers would don blackface for popular musicals such as Johnny Spielt Auf, with black experiences rendered appropriable in the long term for a white German public. Simply put, neither the German star system nor its capacity to produce these star images did much for Black Germans, Black Americans, or Africans who were often, due to the socialization of their film audiences, equated with their very fictional roles that they portrayed. General agency was denied to them. So this is where I actually want to praise the moment that at least we carried up to 2025. The relative novelty in celebrating, say, the contemporary careers of Malik Bauer, who played in Sam the Saxon, Mo Asumang, who played in The Ghost Rider, Florence Kasumba, who was in Black Panther, and Tyron Ricketts, who was in Soko Leipzig. It's the fact that prior to the 1990s, neither East nor West Germany did much to promote the careers of their own black actors. So this talk sort of covers and compares a few of the biographies of working Black German or Black American or African actors who became subsequently hyper visible, in Damani Partridge's terms, as Black persons in white German-dominated productions during this period of 1946 to 1989. Now the stakes of this are kind of simple. How do we afford full dignity and agency to these people whose performance has been called exceeding representation? And they're often found in genre films such as crime thrillers, science fiction epics, westerns, children's films. I want to also say both film systems in East and West Germany were heavily state subsidized, which means that racial casting politics of the film industries are also an expression of each respective German state. Lack of representation in casting, in other words, is a direct result of political will. I also found very useful the notion of racial isolation promoted by Ethne Quinn, in which black actors must perform a certain version, this is a quote, a certain version of their raced self in costly identity transactions that appease their white colleagues, end quote. It's an uncomfortable truth about both fascist and ostensibly anti-racist, anti-fascist governments of East and West Germany, and their films are still overwhelmingly white. And so blackness then takes its form in the realm of side roles, as in, say, Aubrey Pankey or William Anich's performances in Osceola, a East German Western from the early 70s, or to the realm of an overdetermined signifier of race and history, as in the case of George Bird's performance of Bill in Rainer Werner Fassbinder's The Marriage of Maria Brown. In few circumstances could a Black German or Black American actor obtain a major speaking role in a feature film. And then Black actors could then expect only such roles in independent cinema, such as Joaquin La Habana's performance in Rosa von Braunheim's The City of Lost Souls. And even then, there would be no guarantee that, say, the white German director wouldn't exoticize or exploit them. In other words, I'm just sort of outlining the horizons of possibility of a certain generation of people, and what roles would be available to them, and also how did the media receive them. I'm going to skip a lot of the social context so I can go through as many biographies as possible because there's a lot of people and not a lot of time. Um, I guess the main context is German colonialism, moving through the Nazi racial state, and the exoticization of Black individuals, even while then there are, sort of exterminatory policies that are also parallel to this exoticization. Then the civil rights movement hits in the 1950s, both East and West Germany, and there is confusion within the German populace about how to receive that. The East Germans, of course, adopt um, the Black Communist Party line, as Sarah Lennox's research has argued, whereas the West Germans are much more divided about what the civil rights movement means. But prior to the civil rights movement, there is a film that comes out in 1953 sorry, 1952 called Toxie. On July 23rd, 1952, the FRG news magazine Der Spiegel released a four-page profile on the German film director R.A. Stemmler. And in this, then, the 5.5-year-old star, who's a Black German Elfie Fiegert, was featured prominently there. And again, the caption under her image in that article says, Star Toxie, director Stemmler. And so there, and in the photo, My copy is terrible, so I didn't want to put it on a slide. Fiegert and Stemmler are talking eye to eye, so he's kneeling down and they're looking at each other. And This photo suggests sort of racial equality. It's very staged, but the caption suggests otherwise. Fiegert isn't named. She's called Star Toxie. She's called her fictional role. She's not called her real name. Um, and her character, sort of made by a white team for white German audiences, conflates then Fiegert, the actor and real person, with this. And then the word star then is kind of mockery because she's starring in this role, but not, as herself. Furthermore, the film describes it as describes her as a symptom. Sorry, the article describes her as a symptom of race problems, and also says it's a very German film, highlighting the centrality of this social problem and the quote unquote problem of Toxie and by proxy Fiegert. So that's where we start actually before we move into the East and West German story. And so if you have this conflation of the star image, um, sort of the fictional person and the real person, which someone's erased, it doesn't actually lead to the kinds of racial or interracial dialogue that were perhaps planned. Then we move into the East German story. Two of the people I like to highlight are Julius Ongewe and Aubrey Pankey. Whenever and wherever the East German DEFA science fiction films are screened, for example, cannot help but comment on their international multiracial character. They're cast with actors from Africa, East Asia, Eastern Europe, and even North America. So in Silent Star, there's a Kenyan medical student, Julius Ongewe, who's this key figure and is part of the director's active efforts in the late 1950s to keep a racially mixed cast. He puts out a casting call actually for well-dressed Africans in 1957, explicitly to complement all the white European actors in the film. And then he said he chose one of the more attractive men to take on the role of Talua. That's Julius Ongewe. So Ongewe is hired pretty much explicitly based on his skin color and his attractiveness rather than his acting background, which he had none. He was a Kenyan medical student. Um, he actually spent the whole duration of his time on Silent Star, this science fiction production, studying for his medical exams at University of Leipzig. And then I've documented in other research sort of structural racism about his pay structure. He was basically given um, a reduction in pay because he was a foreign student, and they made it up to him by repurposing some spaces on set so that he could put up a skeleton, kind of a mini medical studio. And these biographical details are interesting because then we lose on Gateway's trail more or less when he leaves his medical study in the GDR. We have the paper trail, and it goes away once he leaves back for Kenya. Talua, his character, is featured in less than 10 minutes of the film. He's always sort of a helpful and cooperative cosmonaut. But then, we have to understand in film history, this is now received as the first black astronaut in film history. And and there is a tension between his lived experience, what he's portraying on film, and how this is then received. um, I have a larger comparison with Nichelle Nichols that I want to at least highlight. That she played Uhura on the Star Trek set a bit later on TV, and is often upheld in a similar way as Julius Ongewe as this kind of signal of a multicultural society. And nevertheless, if you actually read her biography, she has a lot to say about the racism on American television sets. And Sidney Poitier also has a similar experience in the 1950s. So what I'm suggesting here in this paper is that West and East Germany in the United States are all actually going through similar structural racism, uh, processes at this time, and that they're not as distinct as we'd like to think. Another example from East Germany is Aubrey Pankey, who his story is documented in Kira Thurman's Singing Like Germans, a book I recommend to everyone to read. He was an acclaimed opera baritone singer, and he had letters from cultural ministry that actually secured him his entire state support and long-term residency in East Germany. Um, However, he had a sort of honeymoon period in the late 50s that came to an end in 1959 when he grew very, very mad that he was always assigned these Black American male roles, such as Porgy in Gershwin's Porgy and Bess. And he offended as a classically trained singer. And despite being invited by the state composer of East Germany, Hans Eisler, he wrote a letter to Walter Ulbricht, the state secretary at the time, and says, "I would have been happy to have shared in this evening of American music. But what has made it impossible for me is the fact that, as it turns out, the invitation was extended to me not because I was a singer or an American, but strictly because I am a N-word." The section of the program devoted to American songs will be sung by other soloists. Of the roles in the cantata, the only one offered to me was that of the N-word preacher. End quote. So this declining sort of Staatsoper role corresponds with him aging into extra roles. There are not that many older men of color in East Germany, and so um, as soon as, for example, there was a script in the late 60s penned in response to Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey called Signals: A Space Adventure, that featured an older, gray-haired African scientist who is saved by the crew. Punky then was offered the role without auditioning for it, and is then brought into all these kind of futuristic sets as kind of the person who represents all of Black Earthlings, right, in his body. His willingness to collaborate on Signals actually then meant he got a number of other roles, including a proper speaking role in the Defa Western Osceola, which I'll gloss over. Meanwhile, in the West, we have the biographies of Günter Kaufmann and George Bird, um, and these are Günter Kaufmann is Black German. George Bird is a Black American, but a Juilliard trained musician under Herbert von Karajan, and both of them wind up in the West in Rainer Werner Fassbinder's films. So Gunther Kaufmann's biography, again, he is born in Bavaria. Um, he actually has quite a sort of healthy upbringing, and it's similar to Pierre Sanusi Bush. It feels very loved and part of German white German society, and he finds himself in Fassbinder's circles and then is brought into films such as Whitey that directly comment on the racism of the United States through this West German film. And Günter Kaufmann's biographical depiction, especially by film scholars, is pretty bad. Thomas Elsässer, whom I've always admired, he pretty much reduces Günter Kaufmann to one of Fassbinder's lovers, and that's just who he is. He doesn't have much of an autonomous acting identity, even though it's pretty much his acting that saves the Fassbinder's final collaboration film with Wolf Graham, Kamikaze 1989, where Kaufman plays the steady sidekick to Fassbinder's unhinged detective, demarking with his own skin an interracial future, as well as actually helping to hold together the bulk of the picture. So Kaufman really does, if you watch Kamikaze 1989, he is the person whose acting saves a fairly mediocre cyberpunk picture. On the flip side, we have George Bird in The Marriage of Maria Brown, who again, I'll treat very superficially, but there's lots of good research, for example, by Ingeborg Meyer-Osicki on how George Bird um, is brought in as a racially overdetermined symbol in that context. But of course, so he's sort of central to the film, but doesn't necessarily get any kind of star power from that. And this is where I want to jump, because we're already near time, to the late 80s, early 90s, where you have Nino Sando and Pierre Sanusi Bliss, and then earlier Hadiatu Berry and Rados Bokul, all of whom were treated fairly well. Rados Bockel rises to star status more or less later in the 90s. She's now a celebrity. Um, and I would say the the curious thing is this sort of adjustment to both the role, the societal role that these people are supposed to be playing. So they still are playing outsiders who are, still more or less portraying their skin color, but are given more and more interior roles that require a deeper acting capacity. And once I again watch kind of Lieb mich again, or No One Loves Me, 1994, in which Sanusi Bliss is pretty much playing this comical stereotype, this gay African witch doctor. You actually see this balance between, here's the past of the black German acting repertoire, and here is the future, which is here is the stereotype, and here's me as a full-fledged performer. So I'm going to conclude with, I've got Philip Cabo Capsel to quote here. He says, any black performer in front of a predominantly white audience is confronted with their own dilemma of representation, meaning that even if you're an anti-racist or progressive film production in that context, where you're going to run into issues. Especially after the George Floyd protests of 2020, there's now a renewed interest, for example, in the work of Skip Norman, who studied with Harun Farocki at the DFFB School in Berlin. There is Armin Folker's comedy Leroy in 2007. And there's also the scholarship of Fatima El-Tayeb and Peggy Pisha as they continue to build on their Black European subjectivity project. And I just want to end that, uh, we're living in a moment where that whole renewed era might be then parenthesed in some way. We're talking about funding issues in the cultural sector and others, and that when we build a newer culture from there, that we should remind ourselves of the racial isolation of so many figures, as they sort of move through during film history, and that the state and the film industry, as well as us ourselves, can help prevent that racial isolation from occurring. And that's my talk for today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Evan. We appreciate that. And again, if you have questions, comments, feel free to pop those into the Q&A. We will address those at the end. I want to get to our next presenter at this point. So next we have Dr. Reginald Bess, and I'll give a bit about his bio. Dr. Bess is professor of English and world languages. He holds a BS in German and Spanish education from West Virginia State, a MALS in humanities from Grambling State. Shout out to the HBCUs. And an MA and PhD from the Ohio State University. He's also the vice chair for the African American Special Interest Group for the American Council on Teaching of Foreign Languages. And his paper is entitled Sam the German, the Officer, the Man, the Life and Times of East Germany's First Black Police Officer. Dr. Bess, you have the floor.
Guten Tag, Nachmittag, good afternoon. Let me say, first of all, that my presentation is for primarily not German scholars, but persons in, let me see if I can get this right. Okay, let's see. Didn't go. Try it again. Speaker. Okay, all right. I'm going to show a couple of pieces. These are in, I put my email in the chat so you can see that these are works, if you can see it, in of Afro-German narratives. They're German with the English translation. I'm putting this up here because I want people, students and teachers in Africana studies, in women and gender studies, in world literature, and African American history to get these works and incorporate them next year in their curricular and something during African American History Month. Here's another group. This one includes the German Kinder der Befreiung, which is the children of the occupation, in which our president, Dr. Rosemary Payne, has a very good essay in translation. Everyone should have this in their library. This has to do with the genocide in Namibia in the early 1900s. We're talking about genocide today in the Congo and Rwanda and other places. But the big one that deals with German studies was in Namibia in the early 1900s. And then, of course, I'm going to be talking about at the very end about these two. Particularly, I'm going to talk about the meaning in German of the title deutsch-deutsches, and I got information from the writer himself about that. And tomorrow, we will be hearing from Malik Bauer, and I want to make sure you know who he is and the series that's on television. And so here with my presentation. Afro-Germans have been writing first-person accounts of their lives for the last several decades. The first such accounts that captivated my attention, first one was Neger, Neger, Schornsteinfeger, Destined to Witness Growing Up Black in Nazi Germany by Hans J. Masterquart. A side note, I met him at a convention in New Orleans. In line to get my book signed, I struck up a conversation in German with the author, telling him that I had pursued German studies at the university in his birth city, Hamburg. My colleagues told me to hurry up. He stopped and saying in English, "I'm talking to Herr Dr. Bess." I've never been more pleased to be called Herr Doctor. Masterquart was born in Hamburg. At age 7, he tried to join a German youth group, but was rejected because he was not, quote, Aryan. Rather, he was, quote, other. His life path took him from Germany to Africa to the United States, where he landed at the then most prestigious Black publishing company, namely John H. Johnson Publishing, and ended up ascending to the manager of Ebony Magazine, Black History. Daheim Unterwegs, Invisible Woman by Ike Huger Marshall, is another very popular piece of Afro-German life writing. The author thinks that she is like the other young German girls because she speaks perfect German just like them. A look in the mirror reveals the truth, namely that she is, quote, other. As the German title, Daheim means at home, and Unterwegs means on the way. The combination is a deliberate oxymoron, suggesting someone seeking a home in her own country. The English title is meant to suggest Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. Masterquart's parents are a Cameroonian father and German mother. Ika's are a German mother and a Black American GI. We heard the previous speaker talk about her father in Germany, marrying a German. Interestingly, after some sleuthing, Ika locates her father. Jennifer Teger, while perusing books in a Hamburg library, Hamburg comes up again, comes across a fact in the book that shakes her to her core. Her grandfather was a horrible human butcher, Amon Gert. He is depicted in Steven Spielberg's Schindler's List. She instantly comes to the realization that had her grandfather known that his granddaughter was, and this is a despicable term, Mischling, mein Großvater hätte mich erschossen. My grandfather would have killed me. A Black German discovers her Nazi past. The German and English titles of her work. Her biggest concern is wondering if her Jewish friends would continue to be her friends if they would reject her once they knew her ancestry, her parentage, African father, German mother. The last piece of Afro-German life writing that I would like to mention before I turn to the subject of my presentation is Deutsch sein und Schwarz dazu, Black and German, an Afro-German life in the 20th century by Theodor Michael, dubbed the Dean of Afro-German Studies. Michael was born in 1925, Masterquart 1926, Ike Hugel Marshall 1947, Teger 1970. He was born in Berlin. He died in 2019 at the age of 94. His father performed in a circus. Michelle and his sister and brother were taken in by her circus, her father's circus colleagues when when their father disappeared. His three siblings decided to flee after Negroids were declared undesirable in 1936, but Michel remained. The Nazis cast him in a tiny role, very visible, made in Germany's first color film in 1943, Münchhausen. Later, he learned that the movie had been commissioned by propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels and will be used against blacks. Quote, they trained me, and it is, of course, extremely ironic that it was the Nazis who gave me my big break, end of quote. What I would like to point out, and our president, Dr. Rosemary Payne, has written extensively on this, is the work's preoccupation with Staatslos. I'm not a citizen. His family members and other black Germans were Staatslos because of the color of their skin. Historical note, birthright citizenship. I think you've heard about that in this country. It's come up recently. Think about it. I should mention no names. I also Afro-Germans eventually were written into the German Constitution. And just a quick note, in 2022, the library in Cologne was dedicated to Theodor Michel, and all of his works are housed there, and other works that deal with Afro-German life and history are there in the library in Cologne, named after him, a great feat for the Dean of Afro-German Studies. The works cited above and others that I do not have time to mention, I shared my biography with them by email, and I put my email in the chat. I label them as poetic journeys from innocence to experience. For the most part, most unlike the work that is at the center of this presentation, Sam, the German officer, Sam, the man, the officer, the German. These autobiographies fall into the subgenre traditional autobiography. That means, of course, that the narrative comprises three sections. The introduction, a body that often progresses chronologically through different stages like childhood, adolescence, adulthood, a conclusion, where the author reflects on her life experiences and lessons learned, a beginning, a middle, and an end, with each section focusing on different periods of the author's life. The narrative structure of Sam, and this is how I should refer to him for the remainder of this presentation, does not follow the one just described, and it is the intent of this presentation to place it within another subgenre. Let us begin. Samuel Mefฟี่. Ich, ein Sachse, mein deutsch-deutsches Leben. Sam, the German, the officer, the man, the life and times of Germany's first Black officer. Note, Malik Bauer stars in a production, a seven episode series that is available on Hulu and Disney Plus. In one of the first scenes of Samuel Saxon, we see Samuel Mefฟี่running full strength through the streets of Dresden. Sam stands out, not just because he is literally chasing ambulance, but because this is 1989. We're in Saxony, deep inside communist East Germany. And Sam is a 6-foot-something black man. Samuel Mefฟี่, East Germany's first Black policeman, became a media star after reunification, but ended the 1990s in jail. He says, in the end, I think it goes back to losing my father, who had never known him, that left a gap I've been trying to fill all of my life. He continues, after years of therapy inside prison and out, and through the support of his wife and my wife and family, I am whole again. He lives with his wife and 2 daughters in Bonn, making his life as a writer and is a coach for workers in the public sector. In other words, a social worker. In the first chapter of Sam, the translation, the reader gets a sense of the meaning of the words in the title, Man, Police Officer German. The protagonist's daughter has a box that contains memories of his previous life. His explanation to her then begins the story of his life. Permit me to give you a condensed summary. Samuel Mefฟี่was born in 1970 in Sankau, near Leipzig, son of a Cameroonian and a German. His father dies on the day of his birth under mysterious circumstances. From then on, his mother tries to raise him and his brother alone. She drinks, becomes violent, and Sam finds support only with his grandparents in Dresden. In school, he excels at sports, apprentices as a mason, works odd jobs, and does military service with the paramilitary units of the People's Police. His life isn't easy. The Berlin Wall falls in 1989. Subtle everyday racism in East Germany turns into brutal xenophobia against the nation. Neo-Nazis run wild and burn refugee communities. Sam wants to make a statement, so he joins the Saxon police force, completes training, and becomes the first Black officer in East Germany, gaining fame almost overnight. In 1992, his face is on billboards nationwide with the slogan, "A Saxon in Black and White." The award-winning and anti-racism campaign turns the 20-year-old into a media star, poster child. Although things look good on the surface, talk show appearances, being hailed as an exemplary cop, things are falling apart. So he resigns and forms a security agency in 1994. It fails. He gets involved with a local figure in the red light district, robbery and assaults. He is now wanted and is now labeled public enemy #1. He escaped to the Congo where his uncle lives, gets caught, is returned to Germany, and is sentenced to 9 years in prison. He spends 7. In prison, he rehabilitates himself, and upon his release, becomes a social worker and a successful author. Let us take a look at some particulars in the work. I'm going to rush through this. They will, I dare to hope, help me to identify the true genre of this work. One particular experience that he remembers is, and this is a flashback, is essential for grasping the dynamics of the Black-white relationships, power, political, and racial and other identities in the work. The following is described in Chapter 1, which has the heading Bonn, mid-July 2021. This is also the same heading in the last entry of the book. He writes, in the presence of the article, carefully repressed feelings, and feelings are very important, is a key word that figures in how I shall characterize this type of narrative. Hint, it does not fall into the subgenre of traditional biography. I'm rushing. He writes, here we go. N-word, fucking dirty N-word. They yell and rage in the hallway. They ram the door over and over again. Come out of there. You and your whore. You're dead on the ground. Move to the ground. Someone yells. A commando, a threat. Is that my voice? The minister like handshake. I'm counting on you, Sam. Talk about why you become a police. Think about why you became a policeman. Think about what's on the line. The following chapter finds us in Cameroon in the 1950s. This is certainly not chronological. Taking quite a bit of authorial authority, the author describes his ancestors' daily living routine in Cameroon, how his grandmother became a Christian, from whom he inherited his first name, Samuel, and the circumstances in which his namesake ended up in Europe. Page 15. The Lord has a plan for each of his children, grandmother whispers to him in the semi-darkness of the hut that smells so pleasantly like dried banana. The same chapter introduces his mother and father and how they met in East Germany. Pressed by his daughters, he cannot avoid telling them the complete story. He writes, "Last exit, this is my last opportunity. It's a chance for me to say that I have to work. Drink your cocoa and be still. I love you, but leave me alone." I should say that now. Yeah, exactly. Una says, "What happened to Grandpa?" I've had to endure stares before from emotionally stunned, robot-like enforcement bureaucrats, downright uh, omnipotent prosecutors and judges, unpredictable Congolese secret police, vampires pumped full with hate and cheap drugs. But Feli, his other daughter, one daughter is Una, stare is something else. It's playing in totally different league. I've gotten no chance. I give up. A man has to know when he's lost. I sit down in the kitchen and start to talk, and that begins a discussion of his life. Another telling experience he points to and in the novel, in the work, is he describes his birth as if he's there watching it. This is brilliant writing. He writes, "She can feel the tiny little life pushing forward little by little through the narrow canal in which it must perform the absurd feat of a quarter turn. My mother pushes and screams, and then the giant fist that she makes with her hand suddenly disappears. Someone screams, 'It's a little hungry, growing bird.' The mother doesn't suspect that not only has she given birth to another child, but it's become a widow almost at the same time. So his mother births him, he's there watching it, and his father is killed. Oh, I'm going ahead of myself. The final depiction that I would like to refer to is Meffire's description of his father's demise. The speculation that the father was poisoned so that he would not impregnate another German woman and bring uh, more of those mixed children to the German world. Meffiere writes, "Are they going to have to consider his claim that he's been poisoned? If a black man dies, there will be hell to pay. Western guests are holy cows. What kind of headlines will be in foreign presses? Has he the stuff? Has the stuff already worked?" This is what he imagined that the men who poisoned him are saying. "Has the stuff already worked?" That's what my father heard from the rumbling of those voices in the front of his door. So, I'm at the end almost. How do I characterize this work? This is a memoir. Quote, "A memoir is a collection of personal memories related to specific moments or experiences in the author's life." So, where did we get these experiences from? And the answer to that, I contacted, I have 2 minutes, I contacted Meffiere himself, and he was very gracious with his time. What I do is I'll send in an Instagram at 12 or 1 o'clock at night. So the first thing they read in Germany, and the next morning will be my Instagram, so I get a response. He writes, "Dear Dr. Bess," no, let go, wait. "Dear Dr. Bess, of course you were sticking the finger in the wound." I asked him about his narrative process, where he got his material from. "My description of the scenes in question is based on the stories of my mother, my grandmother, and the 14 boxes of estate that came to me after my mother's death in 2014. And of course, I'm pleased with your praise of the text. Warm greetings from Bonn, Samuel Meffiere." And then finally, what does he mean by his subtitle with the German "Ein deutsch-deutsches Leben"? I asked Malik Bauer about that. He gave me his explanation. So I went directly to the source. And here's what Meffiere writes. "Dear Dr. Bess, mein deutsch-deutsches Leben is an unambiguous play on word and in relation to any origins of the influences of my life. Through my father's origins from Cameroon, a former German colony, and my great-grandmother came to Christianity and the faith through German missionaries. German points to my childhood in the former GDR, that is the East German part of Germany, with its anti-colonialist, anti-racist ideals, and at the same time, only poorly educated master race ideology, at least at that time. My father came to the German Democratic Republic to study, and German, uh, meaning experiences and intensive experiences with the reality of the whole of Germany until the fall of the wall. For many people, it is surprising that Germany, for me, it's different. States of matter always have been and will be beloved home and place of longing. And this is also reflected in Germany, through and through my heart and root place, kind regards for Germany, Samuel Mefฟี่. And that, of course, is a field that I'm not familiar with, but it's called resocialisierung or resocialization, where you're coming from one specific area and going to another. That is, his Deutsch is coming from, as Malik explained, it also coming from East Germany to West Germany. The book ends with the very popular expression. Shakespeare called it all's well that ends well. The German expression is alle gut, alles gut, in the gut, alles gut. And I thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bess. We appreciate it. Thank you. So our last presenter, and I'll give the bio first and then go to the title of the actual presentation, is Dr. Albrecht Classen, is University Distinguished Professor of German Studies at the University of Arizona, focusing mostly on pre-modern German and European literature. He also works in modern literature as mirrored by his talk today. He has currently published 133 books and around 830 articles, such as Nature in the Middle Ages, Globalism in the Middle Ages, and Magic in the Middle Ages. A new book, almost ready to be submitted, will deal with the miracles and wonders in the Middle Ages. He is the editor of several journals and the author of 14 books of his own poetry and 4 books of satires. And his paper is entitled Crime, Revenge, and Justice from, and I'm going to mispronounce the name, so I'm going to skip that part. But he'll present it in a second so you can hear it then. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith, so much. I'm very pleased to be with you. So let's first check whether the sound carries well. Good, thank you. Excellent. I'm very happy to be in this panel, and my salute to Evan and Reginald for your papers. Very interesting. I learned quite a lot. It's not quite my area, but I think very, very important what you were saying. And I will give a PowerPoint presentation. That means I will share, and we'll do this way. Okay, very good. So Keith, please confirm whether you can see this. Okay, so yeah, it's visible. Very nice. Thank you. So I'm taking a little bit more broadly conceived approach, and we'll look at these key words that determined, of course, our conference. So crime, revenge, and justice. And I will try to argue that when we perceive or pursue these topics, we'll be suddenly able, in a wonderful way, to trace the discussion from the Middle Ages to actually the very present. So I will look at these various texts. Namely, I begin with the Nibelungenlied and then turn to Heinrich Wittenwiler and conclude with some comments on Heinrich von Kleist and Conrad Ferdinand Meyer. So I create an arc from about 1200 to the late 19th century, but I hope thereby also to address universal issues that hopefully will be of great relevance for all of us. I have a first section in which I will reflect on the purpose of literature as such, because I think it always is extremely important for us to reflect upon what we do, why we do it, how we can convince our students that there is relevance to it, and that even older texts can really shed important light on concerns that are of relevance for us today. So I like to say then, of course, literature is always or needs to be entertaining, somehow appealing in general. but it also very regularly needs to arouse emotions, and it from there then of course we need to turn to critical reflections on issues in society as mirrored in these various poetic works. So at the same time, when we look at literature, we are able to gain some kind of historical awareness, because we never live in a historical vacuum. We live in a historical continuum. And the more we understand how older texts, that are from the Middle Ages, impact us today, the better will we be able to understand the transition of ideas, values, concepts, stereotypes, and other issues. And I am very interested in the topic of justice. And I think that is a very universal concern, of greatest concern, particularly in our own country, where I think there are some problems with our justice system. Then, of course, the issue of morality, honor or dignity, and ultimately ethics. So in a way, I like to argue that in the humanities, we carry out extremely important duties and obligations, because we provide our students with a platform where we can discuss these four major issues: justice, morality, honor, and ethics. I do not want to say this is only a past event, but rather it's the same. Whether we look at modern movies or medieval heroic epics, ultimately we in the humanities have the task of really trying to give our students a sense of criticism, critical thinking, and understanding of their own world, sometimes through a historical lens, sometimes through a modern lens. So as I'm saying here, literature is really a medium to investigate society, relationships, or all these issues that come up here. Of course, racism. Racism was certainly in place already in the Middle Ages. Sexism, of course, that's throughout times. Ageism, and then, of course, xenophobia. So all these issues, unfortunately and tragically, that concern us so deeply, affect us deeply, bother us and trouble us deeply, they already have been around in the past. And so we can explore the issue of justice, for example, and revenge, that's my topic, also through older materials. So unfortunately, I think that from earliest times until to today, people or peoples have been violent, and literature has always mirrored that to some extent. So if you look really far back and you begin with ancient Greek poetry, namely Homer's Iliad or Virgil's Aeneas, or then the anonymous medieval epics Chanson de Roland or the Middle High German Nibelungenlied, then you will suddenly face very fundamental issues. They were all the bedrocks, at least of Western literature, and we derive much of our ideas and values from those poems in many different iterations and manifestations. We are, of course, then required not to idealize these texts too much, and rather we have to be very critical in the analysis of what past poets have said and try to figure out what it really means for all of us. So we cannot close our eyes to the absolute brutality, goriness, and genocidal approaches that are reflected in many texts already in the past. But we can also not anachronistically sanitize them. In other words, even though, let's say, Homer or the Nibelungenlied are foundational texts for all of us in a larger context, we need also to analyze them critically and see what is happening in the background. They are here to stay with us. We will never be able to wipe off the face of the earth Homer's Iliad, but just as much violence will always stay with us. And I just need to refer you to the very recent cases of Magdeburg in Germany and New Orleans That was early January. I just saw the site, but now we have more cases, Munich and so forth. So unfortunately, this is all very tragic. But yet at the same time, we need to explore these literary texts in our quest for justice, glory, honor, and personal dignity. If we do not have those aspects, then it is a big question what human life even would constitute. So these literary texts have deeply shaped our culture. That means also our subconsciousness and hence our identity. And I will try to illustrate this in concrete cases. I spend more time on explaining and commenting on these things instead of later going to the details, because these works that I will discuss are too extensive for a 20-minute talk. So I will just allude to them quickly, as long as we have here a theoretical model to understand why we do literature and what we can achieve with that. So we're getting the good and the bad. We get violence and peace. We get hatred and love. We are always confronted with the topic of sexuality, religion, homophobia, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and xenophobia. Unfortunately, we have heard of this already in the last two talks a little bit, and I will add to that to some extent. Of course, we also look for the aesthetic dimension. Literature is always an aesthetic pleasure. And we also try to understand the literary historical component of the context. And so we can, as modern researchers do, explore the emotional background that are outlined in those texts. And what more recent scholars do, look at the mental historical character of our texts. So, and finally, the reflection of everyday culture. And sometimes even the worst texts reveal some of the very mundane, trivial, pedestrian components at a certain time. So the literary study is not simply something esoteric and abstract, but rather we're looking at the history of people, what they have to say, and how they acted and what they did. Quick reflection on the talk I heard by Dr. Jason Jacobs Roger Williams. He's at Williams University, and he talked at the MLA in 2025, so in January. And he made a very interesting observation. He looked at a number of medieval epics where we have absolutely brutality and genocidal efforts. And while he was doing that, he looked at modern editions of those texts and looked at the dates and times when they were edited. And he suddenly had to point out that, yes, there was a lot of violence, but look at all these genocides as they have happened in the in the 20th century. The Armenian genocide, the German Holocaust, the Bosnian genocide, the Rwandan genocide, the Isaac genocide in Somalia, the Anfal campaign in Kurdistan, the Cambodian genocide, the Bangladesh genocide. Then we have the massacres of the Hutus during the Congo War. Then we have the Darfur genocide, 2003, for example, the genocide in Ethiopia. We have the genocide right now in the Russian-Ukrainian war. That is, of course, already in 2014, and now, of course, 2022 until the present, or the current Rohingya genocide in Myanmar. So we can simply go on, and we suddenly realize that all the gory details in the past actually pale in face of what the 20th and 21st century had to witness. So what I want to do is then look at a couple of examples. We face all these issues such as crime, revenge, justice, war, genocide, and history continues. There is nothing new under the sun. The human nature is what it is. It's not going to change ever. And we have really to ask ourselves, can we ever come to terms with this horror? In a way, of course, no. We will never be able to do that. And yes, we must, because this is our destiny as readers and as teachers, namely to come to terms with the good and the bad in human people. And literature is one of the best lenses to do just that task. And yet we have to be humble and accept that we are not much better than people in the past. So looking at devastating texts such as in the history of German literature will allow us to explore issues such as justice, revenge, violence, and so forth. I want to argue, however, and that is really an intriguing component, I think, that already in the Middle Ages, poets voiced severe warnings about violence and wars or hostilities in general. So if I take the very first text written in Old High German, the Hildebrandlied, and I stay really brief, but I'm happy to answer more questions in the Q&A session. If you take the very first text, Hildebrandlied, where the old father and the young son encounter on the battlefield, and they can no longer communicate and begin then to fight against each other and kill each other, as far as we can tell from the fragmentary outcome. Then, oops, sorry, next one. If I take the Nibelungenlied, which is the most famous German heroic epic, where you have murder in the beginning, then wars, and ultimately the whole point of revenge. And this revenge does not leave anyone alive except three characters, the Hunnish king, Dietrich, and his liegeman, Hildebrand. So the outcome there in this text is absolute devastation. So a warning about the downfall of communication, the warning about revenge, which leads to complete annihilation and Armageddon. Same thing then in Roland's Lied and others, where you have war scenes where then everyone dies because of hate, of arrogance, and a lack of circumspection, and then, of course, the war itself. Another example, just to take us into a different register, would be Heinrich Wittenwiler's Der Ring around 1400, which is a satire and ridicules really the peasant population. But the key point is that the poet presents here two communities, two villages, and they have interactions. There's a wedding, and some violence happens. There's actually just a little accident, some little blood is shed, which, however, then immediately erupts into violence. That violence erupts into hostilities. Those hostilities transform that into a war campaign, and those then lead ultimately to the complete destruction and annihilation of the complete village. So Wittenwiler warns us about the Armageddon. And so the question really is, throughout times, do we exist in Inferno or in Purgatory? We certainly do not live in Paradiso or in paradise. In the subsequent centuries, you have then in Germany the 30 Years' War, and I refer you quickly to this famous novel by Hans Jakob Christoffel von Grimmelshausen, the very famous Simplicissimus from 1668, as the name of the historical event actually tells us, 30 years. So 30 years of warfare out of religious reasons, and Grimmelshausen then reflected in his novel the devastation and the catastrophe for people throughout time. So warning about violence. Moving very quickly to about 1800, and referring you to one story, a novella by Heinrich von Kleist, one of the most famous writers around 1800, namely Michael Kohlhaas. This is studied in every high school in Germany, Austria, or any other German-speaking world, because the issue here is injustice. Michael Kohlhaas suffers injustice, and he tries by all means to gain his justice, and he realizes very quickly, it's almost Kafkaesque, that the bureaucratic system prevents him from getting his justice, so he takes justice into his own hands, and very quickly has some successes, but that turns then into violence, and ultimately he gets into a vicious cycle where violence exists for violence sake, and he is ultimately then apprehended and executed. And so the message by Kleist is really the disaster when people turn to violence and try to adjudicate that themselves. So the big question here, but throughout times in all scriptures, is who is entitled to avenge injustice? What does justice mean? Who has really the authority to carry out revenge? Can an individual take up the sword and fight against those who have committed injustice? And can an individual fight the entire system? Think about this horrendous component of collateral damage, and what does justice really mean, and what justifies violence in order to gain justice. Think about this highly, highly problematic issue, the Gaza war, Israel against the Palestinians. Horrible. I just touched that. That's a political issue. I don't want to get much more into the details. And I want to end with a brief comment on this amazing ballad, Die Füße im Feuer, Fire in the Feet, by Conrad Ferdinand Meyer. I believe that this ballad from 1882 was the source for the American statement to hold someone's feet to the fire in order to get justice or truth. Meyer, however, organizes something else. This is a really fantastic ballad where we are situated in the times of the Huguenot wars in France. So genocidal persecutions of Protestants in France in the 17th century, and begins with a king's messenger, Catholic, who knocks at the castle because the storm is so bad he cannot travel any further. He enters, he's welcomed, and he suddenly realizes that he has entered the same place where just 2 years ago he had murdered the Lord's wife. He had put her feet into the fire, trying to force her to reveal the location of her husband, and the poor woman then died from that horrible torture. This messenger begins to realize that he's in greatest danger. He sees also how one of the children who has recognized him whispers something into the Lord's ear. So this messenger knows that the husband will do certainly everything in his might to avenge the horrible murder of his wife. Nothing happens, however. Although early in the morning, the husband, the Lord stands in front of the bed where the messenger is resting, and he tells him he has to leave. And so while these two men then ride through the forest, they see all these branches broken off from the trees because of the mighty storm, which is a metaphor. The messenger says then to the Lord, "You were obviously aware that I am the servant of a mighty Lord, and the king, and hence you were coward and submissive." And then the host, whose hair, by the way, overnight has turned from brown to gray, then says something which is here in German. Du sagst dem größten König eigen, heute ward sein Dienst mir schwer, gemordet hast du teuflisch mir mein Weib und lebst. Mein ist die Rache, redet Gott. So that means the Lord's great hair indicates that overnight he was struggling all the time. He wanted to avenge himself, but he was religious. And because he was religious, he submitted under God's command, and he did not turn to violence. But that is then shown through the gray hair and, of course, the entire forest smitten by the storm, which is then a mirror or symbol of his internal struggle. From here, I could go on at length, but I need to watch time. Yes, my time is up. Then, of course, we have the modern times then the opposite, where violence suddenly becomes idealized, such as in Ernst Jünger's Stahlgewitter from 1920. And here's some images, the glorification of the First World War. And I would like to offer here some concluding comments that, first of all, through the lens of literary works throughout times, I can only say that humans have always been cruel to each other. And this, of course, is not an ideal we promote unless you belong to certain groups, but literature tries to fight against that. So genocide might have been the hallmark of the 20th and 21st century. So we cannot be so arrogant and claim that we are so much better than people in the past. The struggle for justice, the struggle for dignity, the struggle for honor, but once again, the struggle for justice and peace goes through all times and finds its expression in many different texts. So ancient and medieval literature often glorified the goriness of the battle, but the poets regularly portray the battle as individual fights. And of course, there is much racism, especially, let's say, in the Chanson de Geste, the French versions. But there is also, throughout times, and I have here 4 examples, criticism of violence, because violence leads only to more violence, such as in the Nibelungenlied, Du Klage, that's a follow-up poem, then in Kudrun, and then in Der Ring. So 4 major texts that resonate throughout times and alert us that sometimes an historical perspective makes it possible for us to understand really the discourse on violence and to give us a voice to fight against racism, to fight against xenophobia, sexism, and many other things. So
thank you so much. I'm going to stop you right there just so we have enough time for more.
And I'm done. And I just say thank you very much for this very kind opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. We appreciate it. And so we do have 18 minutes left in our session, which is good in terms of conversation time. And so, again, if you have questions and or comments for our 3 presenters, please go ahead and pop those in the Q&A. I see that some information has already been shared in the chat, which is wonderful. But please go ahead and pop those questions in the Q&A. I do have a question for each presenter, so I'll start with my questions, but then I'm happy to take audience questions as they come in. So I'll start with Evan first. I was struck by you were mentioning these films in the 1950s, and knowing something about also a bit of sci-fi history and kind of that genre. Also, we have more broadly films which are in that sci-fi mode. And it made me think about the fact that these actors have been walking into a moment, right, where space and the future is often being imagined, which is just kind of this weird coincidence in some sense, right? And so maybe you could say a little bit more, having not seen the films myself, say a bit more about what type of Black future, in a sense, is kind of being suggested. And of course, that isn't the intent of the filmmakers, but because by virtue of the fact that these are some of the first actors at this time and in this space, kind of what that looks like for us.
Yeah, that's a great point and touches on a lot of my research, which is again the Black figure as a signifier of the future to come, where things, are going to be more racially integrated than say in the 1950s. And so I would say well, first of all, at University of Cincinnati, we don't have Black History Month. We have Black Futures Month right now. So all of our programming is towards that. And part of that is then I think a lot of the actors who are tapped for these roles didn't really think too hard about, am I going to be portrayed in a stereotypical fashion? They're thinking, I get to be part of this exciting, portrayal of the future in which I exist. And this applies from Gateway, also Nichols and others. I mean, where they explicitly say, I'm proud to be part of this kind of future looking project in which I'm not erased, but rather, brought into the picture. And so I like to hold that tension between a very much a look forward towards a multicultural society while also a present of, structural racism, or what we call exclusionary inclusion.
No, thanks so much for clarifying that. I think that that tension is really striking, and it's good to hear that you're thinking very intentionally about what that might, what that look like in terms of the work. Reginald, I was thinking through your question or your idea about memoir. And when you mentioned, I believe if I had my notes were correct, that the 14 boxes, did you say 14 boxes from
Yeah,
this?
14, yes.
And so maybe you could say a bit about memoir as this, I mean, obviously is an act of recovery, an act of memory in some sense, right? But then the fact that you have 14 boxes gives you a really graphic sense of how memory has to be put together, right? That this story, which appears to be simply as a matter of saying, well, on this day this happened, and the day after that happened, right? But it's also very much a reconstruction, and then of course a selection, right? All 14 boxes clearly are not going to make it. Information is going to make it into the actual memoir itself. So the process of just simply constructing history and how literature, and writing mediates that process of memory.
Well, that is the brilliance of his writing, the fact that he knew within himself which of these memories to select that he wanted to zero in on. One critic has indeed said that this should have been two novels. And I quite agree because there's so much material. He said, right, 14 boxes. So one has to say, what am I going to do? What am I going to select? What am I going to show the readers? Which of these memories is most pregnant for me to present to the readers? And am I going to be able to uh, describe, craft the memory in such a way that it will be enjoyable, make the reader think, and make the reader continue to read on to see if there are other such memories and depictions in the work. So it's a task. It was a formidable task, because you write as well. 14 boxes, my goodness. That's all I can say about it. It's brilliant, be a tour de force.
No, thank you so much for that. I appreciate it. I think that's a really, I mean, again, excellent kind of response to the question of kind of how, right, that process unfolds. And I know that Evan has to leave because of childcare. So thank you so much for being here. We appreciate you. Talk again soon. For Albrecht, a
Yep.
question about, and I think the way in which you kind of gave us, from the vantage point of several hundred years, kind of working through this material, right? To think
Yep.
about human nature, violence, and literature. And the question I was wondering was about not as simply kind of how literature represents that, but given the theme for our conference, especially this year on justice and reckoning, how does literature also kind of mediate, right, in that
Yep.
process in terms of it
Yep.
represents the world, it represents human nature, but
Yep.
also it can intervene, right, in terms of how humans behave and intervene in the process of even delivering justice. So maybe you could say a little bit
Yep.
about how you
Yep.
see that process unfolding in some of the text that you were discussing today.
Okay, thank you very much. That's a great question. And I think in a way it allows me, allows me also to respond to the previous question for Reginald, because I think what you just said was a key word, memory.
Mm,
We exist through memory.
mm,
And what we really have to do is not to forget the
mm,
suffering from the past. At
mhm.
the same time, we should not drown and suffocate in the memory, but we should use it as,
Affected.
we need to use it as a catapult to move forward. I mean, what we just heard that in Cincinnati, they have called it now for the future. I mean, it's just like the Holocaust. Yeah, that is all very important. We need to remember, but we need to move forward. And I think it's extremely important that we recognize that our memory, our collective memory, is not just the last 20 years. our collective memory is the last 2, maybe 400, 500 years. That is all there, somehow written into our mental genetic code. And that's what we do when we study literature. We kind of uncover that memory. We bring it out of the deep seating into the present, and be suddenly confronted with human nature. I don't say we can thereby save humanity, but we can try at least to improve humanity. And that is really the glory of the literary text, of poetry, the movie, images, and so forth. Reginald, I think you want to say something.
Yeah, I wanted to say to you, I remember you mentioned holding one's feet to the fire, and both you and I are medievalists, and I'm trying to think of the work with the idea of we get the image of ordeal, where there was a person, somebody had died, somebody had been killed, and some fire was brought close to the body, and the body started to bleed. What work was that? Which one was that?
So somewhat similar. That is in the Nibelungenlied, where
Yeah,
Siegfried has been killed. And
right.
of course, his wife, his widow, knows that Hagen had killed him. So
Mhm.
she forces everyone to walk by the corpse. And when
Right.
Hagen walks by, then the body begins to bleed again.
Exactly. Right. The idea ordeal is we got this where we get the word ordeal from.
Yes,
Right.
that's a
And
form
so
of
then
ordeal.
so
Absolutely.
ordeal. And so it which means that things do not change. Plus
Yeah.
cela change, plus c'est la même chose. The more things change, the more
Yeah.
things change. Yeah.
But I also like this very much because it opens up another perspective, because we live in a world of objects. But these
Yes.
objects are not just simply plainly physical material.
No,
They have a
no.
certain agency, either as
Yes.
symbols or
Right.
as entities by themselves. And so by looking sometimes at older texts, we suddenly begin to realize the workings of objects. And,
Exactly.
you know,
Yeah, they can be viewed or they can be something that provokes one to action.
that's right.
Yeah.
For that reason, I
Subject, object.
love the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin,
Oh yeah.
because there are no words, no dates. It's just
Mm.
you and the black stones, and
Mhm.
history stares at your face.
Mhm.
It's like that there is in Ghana there is a body of water and just bodies and nothing else. Some above the water level, some below, and that's it. You're right. You tell the story.
And to kind of think through some of these questions about memory and archive and memorials, I mean, Reginald, I was struck by the fact that when you began your presentation, you showed us several different book titles.
Mhm.
And I want to just also kind of do a personal plug to note that for those of you who are on campus, who are at Rutgers Camden, we actually just donated to the Paul Robeson Library several of the books that you were referring
Okay, good.
to. So there's now a BGHRA collection, right, dealing with Black German history and literature at the
Okay,
Paul Robeson Library. That's information. The books are there, and they'll be cataloging and putting those in proper order over the
excellent.
couple months. But I want to ask a question then. This kind of goes to both of you as it deals with the actual repository. So, for instance, where are those locations for folks who are doing the work, right? Doing the work of both kind of recovering literature, but also specifically dealing with Black German history, Black German literature. Also, when it comes to simply kind of thinking about kind of medieval works, where are those spaces, repositories, collections that people can go to and actually learn more? I'm sure some of it must be online at this
Let,
point.
let me start because I intended to put this in when I started. I held those up and wanted to say, go to your Black-owned bookstore. You
Yeah.
can order any of those books, and I'm going to put it in a chat, and if you email me, I can send it to you. You can get any of those books ordered through a Black-owned bookstore, and please, we've got to support our own. They're available there. And then, if you're in New York, go to Schaumburg, and everything is there. But particularly Black-owned bookstores, to order the ones that I talked about. In fact,
I,
but back before Walmart became Walmart, I got Showing Our Colors from from there. I got the some of the things of my Aim I picked up at Walmart, but that's back then.
Okay, I have a slightly similar but yet different answer. What I think we need to do, and this is really a pedagogic perspective from the point of view of a teacher. I like to take my students, if the group is not too large, into the library. Because you know what? Many of these young people don't even know what a book is.
I don't know where the library is. Come on.
I mean, I enjoy online text that makes it
No.
cheaper for students. And increasingly, let's say Black German literature, it's hard to find sometimes. But if you have it available online, then maybe more. But still, the book itself has an aura of very unique quality. And one, the
Touch it.
haptic. And
Yeah,
I noticed when students are suddenly taken to the book, they are stunned. They are just totally blown off because suddenly they realize this is the best computer in the world. We'll never need a battery, no connection. It is just there to open.
in my brain.
It's a big task. It's our task. I notice that many of my colleagues never go to the library, but it's our task to keep the library or the archive alive. And that could be a bookstore. It can be, there are so many little libraries in my neighborhood, where people just put books in. And that is a new feature post-pandemic. Suddenly the book becomes available and appreciated again. Yeah, it's a struggle.
Definitely the culture of the book is something which has definitely changed, but certainly there's nothing like holding a book, if you can, in your hand. And oftentimes I've also found that sometimes when the books are scanned, pages are not always kind of accurately scanned, or pages are missed, for instance. So if you're into, for instance, the copyright page or some different kind of elements there, you may not find some of those information as well. So we're actually at our 5:26 right now, so only about 4 more minutes left. Again, if there are any kind of comments, questions, feel free to pop those in the chat. I'll just give both of you, since we have two panelists left, just maybe a minute to say any kind of closing words before we wrap up. We are the last panel, I think, for today. So this does conclude our first day of conferencing. It's been such a amazing experience so far. But I'll give you, Reginald and Albrecht, the final word if you have anything you'd like to close out with.
Yes, I wanted to say what I said at the beginning, that my presentation is aimed primarily less at German scholars themselves, but for those of you in Africana studies, teachers and learners, those in women's and gender studies, because we have quite a bit there, Afro-German women writing, for those in European history, talking about the Afro-Germans and Africans in Germany during the Nazi era, world literature and Afro-diasporic studies. That we need to get those works that I mentioned and others into the hands of people in those groups so that we become more global. We've got to become more global. We're becoming too restricted, too parochial, and doing so will make us more global, but just more open and more humane.
Thank you. That's beautiful. And my final comment would be, picking up a little bit what I said before, I firmly believe that the study of any literary text or any, let's say, fictional text or narrative is the gateway toward the exploration of honor, of morality, of justice, freedom, equality. Those are the values we need to carry on, and the study of literature becomes hence this basic glue that can build community and can allow us to understand what was wrong, what was bad, what was catastrophic, but what also leads then to love and happiness and peace.
That is so true. We can see that today, looking at our political leadership. You can tell who is read and who has not.
Yep, 100%. So oddly enough, we are in the literary profession very dangerous individuals.
Yeah, we know too much.
We are critical thinkers, so
We know too much.
Power of the word for sure. Well,
Yeah,
um,
yes.
I think those are definitely important words to end with. Thank you both, Evan, even in his absence as well. It's been a really good conversation. Thank you all to our audience for being with us today. We have two more, so hope to see you all bright and early tomorrow morning. We'll begin with yoga as we did today, and looking forward to the keynotes and panelists for the next couple of days as well. You guys, if you're in the evening, have a good evening and
All
enjoy the
right.
time.
Thank you very
thank
much.
you,
Thank
Keith.
you. Thank you, Keith. Thank you.
Much appreciated. Great,
You're
great
welcome.
work.
Thank you.